Well, it really wasn't a big surprise that Shogun became a miniseries. The book was published in 1975, the James Clavell book. And he had written two other novels before that, Taipan and King Rat, which were big.
A director. And we watched a couple of miniseries that Jerry had directed and decided, well, let's meet him.
And the first thing he said when I met him, he says, "Are you crazy?" Because I said, "Why?" He says, "You got to be mad to tackle a project this big, and it's impossible. I said, I'm writing it, but I don't know if we'll ever be able to make this thing."
I said, it's going to ruin your marriage, it's going to ruin your life, everything I could imagine to shake him up. And he didn't shake. And at that point on, we became bound at the hip. Because if we hadn't been, the whole thing would have fallen apart.
They sent me to Japan to do some location scouting. And that whole idea of how to work with these people, Clavell he knew it upside down and backwards. So he was a big step into breaking us into that culture. And then when I came back, I started reading the scripts, which were quite wonderful. And I said, "You know, Eric, you're going to be there." He says, "No, I'm not going to be there." I said, "You got to be, because, well, you know, we're going to do rewrites and so forth as we go. We can't do it production-wise exactly."
I went to Japan as the writer. And while I was there, Paramount asked me if I would produce it. And I said, absolutely, I would be delighted to produce it. And then Paramount realized they were putting me in charge of a lot of money, and they didn't entirely trust me with a lot of money, because I was more concerned with the product than the budget. And happily, this is another instance of the gods smiling on the project. The person that Paramount chose to bring over as a production executive was Frank Cardia.
Eric went over to do the production rewrite and begin the prep, and that's when he called me, like 24 hours after he got there, and said, "It's spiraling out of control. Can you get involved? And I'm going to recommend to Paramount that you get involved." And so I really got to Japan about 6 months before the actual start of production, and some of the picture had been prepped at that point.
So we were basically a bunch of pals making this movie. To go into a project like this, literally into an unknown world. None of us had ever been to Japan in the 1600s before. It required a certain group of people with a certain attitude to make it work.
Cyrano de Bergerac at the Almonson Theater, or maybe it was Night of the Iguana, I can't remember which. But somebody came backstage. There were a bunch of people backstage one night after the show in my dressing room, and somebody I'd never seen before said, "Have you read Shogun?" And I said, "Have you read Shogun?" It was a hugely popular novel. I just didn't happen to know about it. And I said, "No." And he said, "Read it. Make a great miniseries."
From what I heard, that they went to Sean Connery, and he liked the material, but of course he had never done television, so he didn't want to do it. And then they went to Roger Moore. And for some reason, whether he was not available or didn't want to do it, I never heard. And then a whole list came out, Albert Finney and so forth. And I think that NBC said, "Look, we want a recognizable name. Get me one big recognizable name." And of course, Richard was.
I knew I had to play Blackthorn. I had to play Blackthorn. And so I started to chase it down.
He came in and he met us at Paramount, and he looked great. He looked a beard, and he looked like a pirate.
I was all dolled up with a beard and everything, trying to be as Blackthorn as possible, you know. And He bought the act and was very instrumental in getting me the part, because James Clavell really did want Sean Connery, and then he really did want a British actor to play the part. But largely because of Eric, I got the part.
The amount of work that he had to do, physically, forget the words, the amount of physical work that he had to do, Richard had to have been exhausted every single night, because he carried the whole production. It was all on his back.
Well, I read everything I could find historically about this character and about the time. I'm never sure if that does any good. I'm never sure whether that kind of research helped.
Lady, the week before production. And we made the decision not to stop, not to delay production. We couldn't. Eric Berkovici and I made a decision early on that nothing would stop the production. It's that whole analogy about a shark has to keep moving or he dies. We felt that if Shogun ever stopped, it would never restart. Rejuggle the whole picture, and we shot a month without a leading lady.
And then we were drying up. We had to have her. We still didn't have her. There was nobody. And I mean, at one point, Paramount said, well, we'll take an American actress and put her in Asian makeup. And we went, oh, we can't do that. Well, it's impossible. The whole picture's over.
Jerry and I were both looking at videos at night of Japanese actresses, and they kept bringing them to the set. Problem was, we were looking for a Japanese actress who could speak English, and we couldn't find any. And there were a number of Japanese actresses we met who were very impressive, and they said, hello, how are you? I'm so glad to be auditioning for this role. And then when we would ask them a question, they would say, hello, how are you? I'm very glad to be auditioning for this role.
So I remember it was like on a Saturday, and there was like three girls in all of Japan left to read. And then all of a sudden we hear a Japanese girl speaking English that we understood. And we didn't really look at the stage because we were so disheartened we didn't want to look, but we hear this voice, and he looked at me and I looked at him, and it was like two puppets' heads turning and looking over at the stage, and there she was. Yoko Shimada was there.
And we said, well, we've rolled the dice on so many things so far. Let's roll the dice again. And we hired her.
If a woman who belonged to a man, as I belong to Lord Buntaro, if she joined with another man, that would be a serious crime.
She worked very, very hard to be able to learn her dialogue in English and learn her dialogue in Japanese as well.
After audition, 3 days after, my agent called me and he said, you're going to do Shogun. I was just surprised. And Jerry Rondon was full of energy and spontaneous. And he was always there for me, supporting my acting.
My son, Luca, who was in Japan at the time, became hired by Frank, I must say, not by me, to be her dialogue coach. And he literally put every line of English in her mouth.
Luca was my coach, and he was very hard teacher. Sometimes he pulled my tongue. Your tongue is here, not there, here.
It was important that she knew what it was that she was saying. Yes, she had the Japanese translation, but...
Beautiful cove. Just untouched. So untouched, there wasn't even a road down to it. So a road had to be built that led from up above down to the cove so we could get equipment down there.
It was an orange orchard when we first saw it. We had to replace the orange trees that we took out. But it was almost like a cliff that was a horseshoe with a nice little beach down in the bottom, and that's where we built the village.
We kept wondering about, why is this piece of beachfront property undeveloped? And then we learned that this is where the typhoon entered Japan every year. We sort of said, okay. And then we didn't really pay any attention to that. We were too busy making the film. We didn't really think about the typhoon.
One of the big problems in shooting in Nagashima, it was a very remote area. There wasn't even enough hotel space to accommodate the crew. A lot of the crew were living in private homes. There was a Japanese resort about 30 miles away, and most of the American crew stayed there.
We were scheduled originally to leave Nagashima on September 15th, but through a all too familiar mix-up, we lost all of our hotel space on September 1st, which created a large problem that required a rather quick rewrite to get us out of there 2 weeks ahead of time.
I remember on the last day of filming in Nagashima, it started to rain a little bit. And I finished like at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I had my bags packed because I wanted to get out of Nagashima. It was just nothing there. So in the meantime, the crew was going to wrap, and Monday they were going to be in Kyoto, and we'd start. So this was like on a Friday. And Saturday, nobody shows.
The very last day of production on September 1st there, on the very last shot, the typhoon arrived, and that whole set was swept away.
The sets washed into the sea. We had to pay to have them cleaned. We almost couldn't get the crew out. Eric and I and Chio, one of the interpreters, and Anna Mills, our production assistant, were the last to leave, and we couldn't get out. The trains had stopped running. We ended up in this 12-hour cab ride from Nagashima to Kyoto.
So if there had not been a hotel problem, we would have lost our set unfinished. So again, the gods were smiling.
Toho Studios is one of the major production facilities, and we started the picture there. It's on the outskirts of Tokyo. I was appalled when I first arrived. Dirt floors on the stages, very primitive conditions. Their concept of soundproofing was not what we're used to in the United States. Very primitive conditions.
Toho Studios in Tokyo was one of the big studios there, and they can accommodate big productions. They had a tank where we put the mock-up of the Erasmus and built some of the major sets. The other thing is there's no air conditioning. There's no heat. So we started in the heat of the summer, and with all the lights in there, we were hot. Makeup was melting. We had a lot of patting down to do. And then in November, we were freezing because it gets real cold in Japan, and it was cold as hell.
Their film equipment wasn't up to our standards. I think at that point in the Japanese industry, they did a lot of 16 millimeter work, and they had fabulous 16 millimeter equipment. They did a lot of video. Their video stages were phenomenal, state-of-the-art stages, probably better than we had in the States. But their film was a dying industry there, so the conditions there were less than ideal.
It wasn't a little bit of a culture shock. It was a huge culture shock. First of all, here I was in the midst of perhaps the #1 leader in technology at the time in the world. And I found that the equipment, the lights, tripods, just about any motion picture making equipment was no less than 20 years behind times, a lot more in most cases. I think I'm being very, very kind. And it was a shock. It was not something that I could readily and immediately adjust to.
Especially in the lighting. The lighting and the grip equipment. We took our own camera equipment, so really, I mean, that wasn't any difference for us because we took our own. But the lighting units that they use are usually very small, and they don't use the kind of units that we needed to light the huge sets that we had.
We brought our own cameras in from Hong Kong, and we got some from Tokyo. But as far as the grip equipment and the electric equipment, a lot of it was, used for 25 years, and they don't like to change. At that point, they didn't like to update.
They were really ancient equipment. But before that, the original tank at Toho was like a swimming pool and not nearly big enough to hold the gimbals and all of the technical stuff that was needed to put the mock-up of the Erasmus on. So that had to be enlarged. And it didn't fill very quickly. It was like turning on a faucet in your bathtub.
They could only fill the tank at night because when they turned on all of the water to fill the tank, the water pressure in the surrounding neighborhood went down and nobody could take a shower. So they could only work.
President Jimmy Carter came to Tokyo at that time. And every single policeman in Japan went to protect him. And so there were no police in the neighborhood. So if the neighbors were calling in complaints about our noise, there was no one to answer the phone. Happily, we got away with it. American crew to Japan, to a country where they had never worked before, knew very little about, was a great adventure for the American crew too, and not very easy at first. There was difficulty on the technical side. The construction crew and the costume crew had been in Japan for a while. They'd already managed to find a way of working together. The trick really was translators, which was the only way that the Americans could communicate with the Japanese crew. And we were fortunate enough to have some really good translators.
In the beginning, the picture was a hassle. We had 14 interpreters, and everybody was working through an interpreter. And then somewhere during the first month or so, we realized you need about 50 words to make a movie. And once we all mastered those, it was easy. We actually came up with some words of our own. We referred to it as Shogunese. It was a little English, a little Japanese. And we got along just great.
You learn the techniques, and there are techniques to working with an interpreter. I found out that if I talked to the person I'm addressing, not the interpreter, the tendency is to talk to the interpreter. And I listen then, even though you can't understand, listen to the person who's talking to you. And then the interpreter isn't even there.
Since you have objected to my translating your words, Lord Toranaga will have the Lady Toda explain your responses.
I can have no objection to that.
One of the interesting problems we all confronted, and Jerry had the problem more than any of us. Jerry's interpreter was a young Japanese woman, and Jerry would give an instruction to her, and then she would turn to the crew and give the instruction, and they wouldn't listen because they wouldn't take instruction from a woman. We tried to explain, this isn't her telling you what to do, it's Jerry telling you what to do. It took a while for them to buy that concept.
We had to experiment with several interpreters to sort of deal with this gap. And very shortly after we started, it became quite evident that neither I nor Jerry were comfortable with the situation of going through interpreters. Something would always get lost in the translation.
And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy at all, because I think the Japanese felt that being a Japanese-based book, the whole production should have been Japanese. That's what I felt the feedback was. But eventually we meshed, sort of. It never was beautifully meshed because two different...
The whole Japanese culture sort of starts late and works late. And we, of course, start early and quit as early as we can, So they come in 9 or 10 o'clock, and then, of course, everybody's got to have tea. And then they go to work, but they might be working there until 8 or 9 o'clock at night.
I found it difficult to try to deal with a very large camera crew. I had to get used to the fact that unlike in the United States, the camera crew didn't consist of myself and the camera operator and the first assistant and the second assistant. Each camera in Japan had 6 assistants, and each 6th assistant had a certain function which not only was a function I couldn't quite understand, but it was a function that generally would not in the States be assigned to a member of the camera crew.
Some of the Americans went home. I mean, I had an assistant director, a production manager, a prop man. They just said, it's too hard. I can't get what I want easily. And they left, and we had to replace them. It was a very tough job because of the fact that it isn't your normal way of living. I mean, you're living with some entirely different group of people, and they have their own ways of doing things, as we do. And as I said, we blended it in making the film.
ご気分はいかがですか?
They were just incredible.
Shin Nishida was our costume designer, and he was also an historian, and after the costumes were all designed, he became my painter. But he had a World War II leather aviator's helmet. When he put his Snoopy hat on, everybody knew that Nishida-san was really getting ready to paint. Why he did that, I have no idea. But all of the downtime that he was going through, it finally began to dawn on me. He had a mental image that was literally pasted to the inside of his forehead
They would build these fabulous sets, and they would build them like they were going to last forever. We tend in America to build sets that look good on film, but don't last more than a month after shooting. They build sets like you're building a structure that's going to last 100 years. But they didn't know how to age them well, and everything looked brand new, and it just didn't look right on film. We'd try to find artists, or scenic artists, and painters who could come in and age sets. It was a concept they didn't really understand.
When the Japanese paint, they paint realistic, beautiful, new now, but they didn't want to age it. So we brought in an American painter who was able to take those beautiful sets and age them, put the crackle in them and the cracks and the aging.
It was like he rode out of the West with two blazing spray guns, and he could do in 20 minutes what it generally took the Japanese set painters to do in a day.
And they were just in awe of this man, who could come in and paint rust on sets and paint water stains and make things look old. And they really revered him. By the time he left, they threw a big the art department threw a banquet for him. They were just in awe of what the talent that this man had.
Beneath that piece of ground where everyone was looking. So they were evacuated as quickly as possible. The local fire department came, and they were standing around, and they had to be gotten out of the way. And it was Andy Laszlo, our cinematographer, who finally organized Bob Dawson's rescue.
The problem was that we didn't know where he was, and we didn't want to walk. So we started to lift, and by this time I heard him moan and calling out, "Get this thing off of me," is what he said.
Luckily, he had an air pocket, and he was on his stomach, which meant the dirt was on his back. And we could hear him saying, "I'm okay, I got breathing space, get me out of here." In the meantime, we had to call the fire department, we had a helicopter, we dug him out of there. Of course, that was the end of the day shoot, and we saved him.
After the accident, the Japanese crew was very reluctant to return to the scene because they felt there was an evil spirit there that had created all the problem. And everybody was still very relieved that Bob Dawson had not been seriously injured. Everyone was concerned that there might be another accident. And so a Buddhist priest was brought in to sprinkle sake over the ground and give it a blessing.
Because the Japanese were sure that we were, to some extent, cursed, or there was a bad spell, or we had done something wrong. And so they brought the priest out, and with sacred sake, we all got to drink a little sake and spill it around the ground and appease the spirits.
We didn't do the earthquake again for another couple of months. We did it a different way. The second time we did it with a steel cord and a bulldozer, so that when the traps opened, the bulldozer just took off, and then all the traps opened as the bulldozer pulled the cord. But that was really the tragic moment, and luckily he was okay. And I said, "I'll give you the cue. Don't just wait for the cue." Okay. So, sure enough, the tide's bringing in the fishing boats, and they're rowing and they're rowing and they're going forward, and things are getting closer together, closer together, closer together.
The camera was on a barge, kind of sailing around in between all this activity, and I suddenly realized that I didn't know how to time my line.
Everything was moving. All the boats were rigged to explode. All the little boats were rigged to explode. And there was a degree of confusion, and Richard said,
"Jerry, when do you want me to say now?"
You gonna tell me when to say now?
Yes, sir. Okay. No, don't fire!
No.
Hearing Richard say it, the whole set blew up. Every musket was fired, every little boat blew up, and all I could do was laugh. I mean, what else could you do? It was either going to laugh or cry.
Richard's boat goes by, and he looked up at me and says, "Hey, Jerry, I think I screwed up." And I looked at Eric, who was not there. He was on the barge with me when he was there. I looked down, he's on the barge, laying down, holding his sides and laughing and saying, "I told you weren't going to get this."
Now, I did have enough forethought to bring along a bottle of scotch because I needed some help that night. Well, after 133 days, we'd all become a bit nuts. We'd all gone a bit crazy because the end of the tunnel was almost within touching distance. We'd always reach out and say, there it is. We struck 2 sets of dailies the whole time. And one went to California and one stayed in Japan. And I think Paramount stopped watching dailies after the first week. And I think NBC also stopped watching dailies after the first week.
They didn't see dailies, they saw monthlies. I mean, you know, film was shipped over and they saw scenes a month after. By the time it had gone through customs and whatever it had to go through, they saw stuff weeks after it had been shot. And if they, you know, weren't happy with it, we didn't hear about it because it was too late to do anything. We'd left those sets and moved on.
We brought one set of editors to Japan, which worked with me the whole time I was there. And we also had 4 other teams back at Paramount in the United States. So we had 5 editing teams to handle the 5, quote, episodes that we were doing.
We left Japan in December. And in Japan, if you don't ask the right question, you won't get the right answer. So it's not the Japanese fault for holding secrets. It was our fault for not asking the right question. The right question being, can you pack film and soundtrack together? Then they would have said no. But we didn't ask the question, therefore they didn't tell us.
The process is to cut the film into little pieces and cut the soundtrack. And usually the sound and the film are kept in the same box for a scene. And about maybe a month or 2 before we were finishing our shooting, we were told by the Japanese government that when we shipped all this to the States, and we're now talking about millions of feet of film and soundtrack, that it couldn't be together. You couldn't put sound and film in the same box.
So it all had to be unpacked, unwrapped, and shipped separately. But all because we, the Americans, did not ask the right question.
A joke concerning things of great importance is sometimes without humor.
Jerry and I wound up back at Paramount in January, and I guess we had part 1.
And when my wife went to pick up the sushi at the restaurant was empty. And the man explained to my wife he hadn't done any business in a week and a half because anybody who had any interest in Japan hadn't left the house.
I felt from the very beginning that Shogun was very special, and that it was an extremely special opportunity for me as an actor. Special is an inadequate word for the way I felt about it. It was everything to me.
I think it's actually a masterpiece, to be honest with you. And a great and complex work and an extraordinary recension of a wonderful period of Japanese history.
We didn't know it at the time, but history has shown us that it was the most successful show that we did. And for me, personally, it was the only show I ever did without any interference from the studio or from the network.
I was very proud of the fact that by the time we finished that picture, I could have taken that multinational crew and gone anywhere and done anybody's picture. And I was very proud of that.
It was based on a fabulous book, one of the best books I've ever read. I think we delivered the book on film.
I don't think that the American public knew anything about medieval Japan, about 1600 Japan, or about Japanese history prior to 1941. So it was a new world. We brought a new world to television. Frank has a beard, Jerry has a beard, I have a beard. And the 3 of us were really locked at the hip during the whole production of Shogun, to the point where the Japanese used to call us the bearded assholes.
Berkovigi is a legendary character. Did he tell you this story that, well, I don't know whether he tells the story, but it is told of Eric, that he once went into a writers' meeting at MGM. And when everyone was assembled, he pulled out an Uzi and a hand grenade and said, "Right, gentlemen, now this is how it's going to be. Today, the writer's view will prevail."
But once we're finished, I'll tell you a story about Orson Welles that'll kill you. He was my idol, this guy.
I would do Shogun again in a second if I were 30 years younger.
Americans, producers then, as now, go to England to buy actors on the cheap. We produce a lot of good actors, and you can get us for pennies in the pound, basically.
Jerry is yelling, "I want the swans." Japanese are saying, "Can't be done." Jerry is yelling, "Eric, bring me the goddamn swans."
Well, we were drunk the whole time. I know you can't use that, but please don't.